Hello, everybody. My name is Lauren Collister, and I'm the Research Engagement Manager from Invest in Open Infrastructure, or IOI. And I'm very happy to be here presenting on the topic of, quote, reasonable costs for publishing. And before I get started, I also want to acknowledge the contributions of my colleague, Jennifer Kemp, who authored the white paper on which much of this presentation is based. So this presentation is part of a larger project. This is outlined on this slide. We call it the Reasonable Costs Project, and it was funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. You can find all project information and the outputs at the link at the bottom of this slide. This project was intended to study and document how researchers, scholarly societies, publishers, libraries, and various data management and scholarly communication infrastructure providers are actively planning towards their own implementations of public accessibility mandates that were outlined in the Nelson Memo. Now, I must acknowledge that the world today in 2025 is much different than the one we were in when this project was proposed in early 2023. However, our ultimate goals remain the same as we work to wrap up the project later this year. We basically wanted to find out what the costs were for making publicly available the outputs like articles and data funded by US government agencies. These costs were described as allowable in grant proposals in the Nelson Memo, which was released in 2022. And those costs were allowable if they were reasonable. But our question was, what does reasonable mean? And how can we come to an understanding of what to expect in that case? So this presentation covers part of our attempts to figure that out. I want to acknowledge the rest of the project team that worked on this project, as well as our partners and the 25 academic institutions who participated in a hands-on workflow creation part of the project that we won't talk about today. So what we will talk about today is one piece of the puzzle, and that is from our original initial research phase, where we are trying to figure out what we already knew about the costs of publishing and repositories. And I am sharing this because, spoiler, we identified several gaps in the information, and we thought it would be of interest to library publishers and might provide fruitful research and information dissemination topics. We do have two white papers on this topic. One is about costs for public access for research data, and the other is about scholarly publication, which is that second one that I will be reporting from today. Both of these are freely available on Zenodo, and you can also find links to them on our website. You can download them and read them and work from them yourself. But today, to get started, I want to share a key finding that was in both of these papers. And this finding is foundational for the rest of this presentation. And if you only learn one thing from this presentation, I hope that this is it. And that is that there is a difference between cost and price. So I think that as human beings who operate in this publishing landscape, we all kind of have a sense of this already. But let me lay it out for you very briefly. So by cost, we refer to the expenses that are incurred by publishers and publishing organizations in the course of providing access to research outputs. So what is the actual amount of money exchanging hands to pay for the resources or labor involved in making a research output available online? Things like how much does server space cost? What is the salary of your copy editor? How much do you have to pay for digital preservation, for storage and accessibility and retrieval of that? So those are costs. And the other term that we use is price. And that is the charges paid by authors or their institutions in the market exchange for the service of providing access to a public research output. That is, it's the amount that someone charges you for this work, which may be different than the actual cost for providing that service. So we can think of price as what underlies the profits that some publishers make from doing this work, or the overages that a publisher might get for the services that they provide that they then put towards other programs. And the cost, on the other hand, is what is subsidized by those publishers that charge nothing or very little in terms of a price for this work. So these two terms are often used interchangeably. But for the rest of this presentation, I will endeavor to use them to refer to these specific two different concepts here. So, what are our findings? Our overall findings from the white paper are this. For all publisher types, cost is relatively unknown. So, that is what money has to change hands at a basic level to publish something. We do not know a lot about this. Price, on the other hand, we do know some things about. However, what we do know is difficult to generalize. And that's because some prices are per article, like an article processing charge or APC. Some prices are read and publish agreements or subscribe to open agreements that might be paid by an entire library or an institution or a consortium. And some of those are at a system level, some are at an individual level, and some of them can't even be disclosed because of non-disclosure agreements. So, in the context of these public access policies that are being announced in the United States, we heard a lot of questions about this being an unfunded mandate. Who is going to pay for some of these prices? And the really foundational part of that question is the same one that underlies our research on price, because a price like an article processing charge might be relatively easy to include in a proposal for a grant if you know what the cost of publishing an article will be, maybe several years before you might get around to writing and publishing it. However, the US agencies do not include payments to libraries, for example, to offset costs of read and publish deals that might affect everybody in the entire institution. There's really no mechanism for that. So, where does that money come from? So, this link between those public access policies of the US federal funders and the proliferation of different business models has this core issue, which is that the money from the funders wasn't always going to those paying the price for public access. And as I mentioned before, we could find out some information about cost and price, and I'll share with you some of what we did find. So, what do we know? There is significant capability to track article processing charges as a price that people have to pay. As I mentioned, this is relatively easier to comprehend where the money comes from. And there's a lot of research out there now about where that money is sourced from, who pays it, and how much it is. Many publishers self-report this. I've got some examples here. We also have the Directory of Open Access Journals, APC data analysis. One of the most promising things that we've discovered in the course of this work is the growing use of the open cost schema. So this is an initiative out of Germany that allows libraries and other entities to report on how much that institution paid for an article. And they can do that by adding metadata onto something in their institutional repository, for example. So this information can be gathered and used by the institution, or it can be sent to a database, which is the Open APC project, which is also really interesting. I really recommend you check this initiative out if this is at least mildly interesting to you. I think it's one of the most interesting and promising things we've discovered. And I wish I could talk about it more, but I only have 15 minutes, so let's continue on. Another thing that we could find out was large buckets of costs, even if not the specific monetary amounts. We know how much publishers spend annually via annual reports or other publicly available information. Got a couple of links here on this slide. Of course, that information is often not standardized, as I mentioned, and it often appears in PDFs, sometimes with big round numbers or percentages, and sometimes just just the topics of the costs and not the actual amount of money. We were able to find recommendations such as from the Open Access Journals Toolkit about indirect costs, where they recommend buckets of indirect cost that include staffing, office space, IT costs, membership costs, and service fees. So these are some ways to break down those costs, and we're seeing some application of that, but not systematically. And finally, we also have examples of the units of how to break down these costs, and in terms of like the article processing charges for an article, for example. We also have books as units that may have cost or price associated with them. We also have pages such as XML conversion, for example, for sending to PubMed Central. We know about how much that conversion to that format costs per page. So these are some of the things that we do know. Another interesting thing that we found was that there are varying costs by discipline for APC and subscription prices. And this comes from two sources that are mentioned on the slide, and I have the amounts here across the disciplines for both APCs and subscription. And you can see there's a wide variation, which might indicate that different disciplines could have different thresholds for what they consider to be a reasonable price to pay for something like an APC or a subscription. Again, I think this is something that we all know anecdotally, but it is really interesting to see it play out here. And for those of you who might like a visual of this, we have a couple of charts where we show the disciplinary differences here so you can see the wide range. We have APCs here on the left, so you can see the big difference between, say, history, which is down about $200 between 0 and 500, and biology, which is north of $2,000. And we also have the subscriptions here on the right. So you can see that the differences can in low end and high end of subscription prices can be quite wide in some cases. So here's the visual example of this if that suits you more to see those distinctions. So that's what we know, what we could find out and reported on in this white paper. Now there's some gaps that we found in what we don't know and research that is needed. So these include some of the big fundamental questions that we had when coming into this project. When we know the costs, they're often really general, and they're not broken down into those buckets of costs, for example, like those ones in the Open Access Journals Toolkit. We have many reports of, say, general costs for an entire program, which might include those buckets, but we're not really sure what is included in that big number. We also don't know a lot about the difference between the costs, even in aggregate, and the price being charged, often because these are reported in different units. So those are some big questions. In fact, when we had the opportunity to talk to library publishers, we thought this might be an opportunity to lead the way in filling this gap in knowledge. Because what we do need to understand this landscape better are not only standardization in terms like the units being used or what is included in those cost categories in the buckets of costs that I referred to, but also just better granularity in and interoperability of information in general. These are some things that we know libraries and library publishers are very good at. And so we wanted to share this gap with you. We have some specific questions, which I'll share on the slide here. Just some ideas that we came up with, basically our wish list as we were working on this white paper. And that is, whether, an individual library publishing program could share what you already know about your own program, whether that's a budget outline, what are the buckets of cost or cost categories that you are working with in your budget, what is included in those, or any numbers that you might actually be able to share, even about just one cost that you incur. So we'd also love to see cross-institutional sharing of information. So, looking at those buckets of costs across different programs and institutions, or even trying to define what are the units that we can use to collect this information. And we also know that some library publishers have pricing. They charge a fee for their service. And we're really curious about how that compares to the costs that it takes to run the publishing program. And what is the role of that price that is being charged? And are there general practices forming across the discipline for this kind of practice of charging a fee for service? And finally, we did, I mentioned those differences in disciplines and hypothesized a threshold for reasonable costs and price that might be different for historians or chemists or whatever the discipline might be. I'll mention a forthcoming paper by Melissa Cantrell and colleagues, myself included, in the Journal of Librarianship and Scholarly Communication that contains some additional research on this topic. But we would love to have more information from your perspective on what you are seeing in your publishing portfolio. So those are some of our questions. I'm sure that you also have questions based on this. I have a whole list of resources here, and you can also get many of these, all of these and more in our white paper when you download it. And I'll just say thank you very much for listening to me today. And if you pursue any of these topics or something related to them, we would love to hear from you. Here's our email address. Please get in touch anytime.